I'm Dr. Tom Warshawski. I'm a consultant pediatrician with the Childhood Obesity Foundation, and my interest in screen time reduction came through the mission of our Childhood Obesity Foundation, which is to identify, evaluate, and promote the best practices in health and nutrition and physical activity to reduce the prevalence of childhood obesity. So, as a bit of a background around obesity, I'll draw your eyes to the left-hand part of the slide here. So this is 1978. The incidence of overweight and obesity in boys was just a little over 15%, with about 3% being obese. By 2004, this number had almost doubled to 26%. For girls, less than 15% in 1978. By 2004, a little under 25%. So the overall change between 1978 and 2004, we've gone from an incidence of overweight and obesity in children of less than 15% to 26%. And that's going to have dramatic effects in the well-being of our children over the years. Now this slide has sort of migrated a little bit to been condensed for some reason when we just did the slides over here. But this is the effect of screen time in Canadian children. This is 2004 data from StatsCan. But we look at those children who watch less than 1 hour of screen time per day. Their risk of being overweight and obese is just around 16%, almost like it was back in 1978. And there's a direct gradient here, exposure gradient, 1 to 2 hours per day of screen time. Your risk of overweight and obesity goes up to around 23%. And more than 2 hours, it's close to 36%. So a doubling of the rate of overweight and obesity as you increase the amount of screen time that you have. So the Childhood Obesity Foundation came up with a rule for generalized fitness for children, which we call the 5210 rule, which happens to be the same that the American Academy of Pediatrics uses. I think Michigan uses it. It's not exactly rocket science. What we're promoting is 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables per day so that you displace calorically dense, unhealthy foods from the diet. Germane to this talk is 2 hours or less of screen time per day. Also germane to screen time, of course, is 1 hour or more of physical activity per day, because kids are naturally active beasts, and if they're not tethered to a screen, they will get mobile. And also with obesity, there's a strong correlation between sugar-sweetened beverages, so we recommend that there be no sugar-sweetened beverages consumed per day. All of this actually ties in quite nicely to screen time reduction, because so much of these types of unhealthy behaviors are either promoted or encouraged by excessive screen time. So in my talk, I'm going to talk about a little definition of screen time, quickly review the problems with screen time, recommendations coming from various august bodies around screen time, some data for Canadian children and youth, talk about a program we developed called Screen Smart, inspired, by the way, by the work of Dr. Robinson of Stanford, and the Quebec contextualization of that Francine will talk about in terms of Screen Smart Quebec, and a little bit about a possible screen time reduction plan for Canada. So what is screen time? When we talk about screen time, number one, we refer to recreational screen time, so not time spent on Googling up research stuff, not working on your computer, not working on WordPerfect for your school projects, but it's recreational. And it includes all screens, so television, which is still, I think, the most predominant and most influential of the screens, computer games, which Christine has talked about, video games as well. The internet is an increasingly important aspect of screen time now, one which is probably more difficult to control or certainly monitor than is television, and social media, which is, I think we don't really quite even understand the potential effects of social media with children. It can be a force for good in terms of helping kids' sense of belonging, connectedness with their friends, but can also be a source of cyberbullying and other types of things. So it's also very important. So the problem with screen time, I think, begins with the understanding that nearly all human behavior is learned. We have very little in the way of instinctual behavior. So all the patterns of behavior, our patterns of speech or interactions with each other, we have learned over time. And we learn by observing others and the resulting consequences that arise from those actions. And that's sort of the premise of social cognitive theory. So screen time, the different screens promote a full range of behaviors. Many are undesirable, such as the consumption of unhealthy foods and beverages, and they also glorify high-risk aggressive behaviors. and also things like cigarette smoking, unprotected sex. We've been through all that already today. So we know that the data is quite strong in terms of there's an increase of overweight and obesity. I showed you that slide with the Canadian data, but it goes worldwide with increase in screen time. There's increased risk of aggressive behavior. Again, behavior is learned, so aggressive behavior exhibited on screens becomes scripts for children to model, and youth and adults. There's increased risk of mental health concerns, talking about anxiety, depression. Those are all increased in a linear fashion with the amount of screen time that you have. Increased risk of high-risk sexualized behavior. TV, movies, they glorify sexual behavior, early initiation of sexual behavior without any discussion of the consequences or of condom use. There's also an increased risk of ADHD, particularly with screen exposure between the ages of 1 and 3. So each additional hour of screen time per day increases the risk of ADHD by about 10%. So what are the existing recommendations? Well, the Canadian Pediatric Society recommends a maximum of 2 hours of screen time per day and no screen time before 2 years of age. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends a maximum of 2 hours, no screen time before 2 years, and I think very importantly, no television in the bedroom. That second TV has very, very strong adverse effects on children and their development in all those previous areas we mentioned. And with the Childhood Obesity Foundation, our recommendations are a maximum of 2 hours per day, no screen time before 2 years, no second TV in the bedroom as part of our 5210 rule. And the other thing I've just added as I'm thinking about this, people should watch TV together. It's amazing shows that you think are very, very harmless and safe, like the ones modeled on the Disney Channel, can be very corrosive in terms of the way that they actually teach children to interact with each other. So it's very, very important to watch TV together, and then it drives my kids crazy when I do this, but I always comment on what they're seeing and you know, do you think that's important? Look at the way she's dressed, or what do you think this message is? So that my daughter now says I can sit with her, but I can't say anything until the commercial breaks. So this is the percent of children who watch less than 2 hours of computers per day, and this is data from 2001, 2002. The World Health Organization does a worldwide assessment of who's watching, and it's the health behaviors of school-age children. So computer time, we don't see, but what you should see is that amongst girls, 72% are watching less than 2 hours, boys 76 or 65%, and that's in the age range of grades 6 to 8. And then if you go up to the older age range, it's 9 to 10, you have a higher percentage of kids who are watching less than 2 hours per day. Presumably they're studying. So we actually see pretty good results for watching less than 2 hours per day of the computer. This next graph is the percent watching less than 2 hours of TV per day. So we get less kids that are able to stay away from the television. So only 41 to 34% of boys and girls in the younger age group are watching less than 2 hours of TV per day. And at the older age group, it sticks around to 44 to 35%. When you look at the cumulative, both television and computer, hardly anybody meets the guidelines in Canada. And this was 2001, 2002 again. So we see that around 19 to 20% at the maximum are watching less than 2 hours of total screen time per day. So the flip side, of course, is that 80% of our youth are watching more than 2 hours per day. And that 2 hours per day figure is somewhat arbitrary. It's gleaned by data like the one I showed you before, that linear fashion of doubling the risk of overweight and obesity with over 2 hours per day. But this is from the Young People's Health and Context. It's looking at youth TV viewing. This data is from 2004, again, from the health behaviors of school-age children. And we see that this is the number of kids watching more than 4 hours per day during the week. And you can see, again, roughly about a quarter of kids are watching more than 4 hours per day of television. Computer use, probably less than 20% or so are watching more than 3 hours of computer per day during the weekday, and of course it increases on weekends. The data set that is most recent is from 2005-06. Again, it's the WHO Health Behaviors of School-Age Children. Quite a large cohort, over 9,000 kids across Canada, grades 6 to 10. Interestingly enough here, the median daily screen time for grades 6 to 8 students was 4.5 hours per day. So that means 50% of children in grades 6 to 8, children and youth, are spending more than 4.5 hours per day, which represents 30% of their waking hours. In grades 9 to 10, the median was 5.7 hours, so close to 40% of all the time that they're awake is spent in front of the screens. You can imagine the type of inundation they're getting with these types of behaviors and the type of behaviors that's being exhibited to them. Oh, this is such a good slide. This was, they looked at the relative risk of what they called multiple risk behaviors. So you're going to have to imagine now that there's a bar graph on there. But these multiple risk behaviors were 6 different things. They were early initiation of sexual practices. They were cigarette smoking, binge drinking, cannabis use, illicit drug use, and the 6th one escapes my mind right now. But what they did is they pooled all those together as multiple risk behaviors and then looked at how the relative risk increased by the amount of screen time, computer time you had. And there is, you can imagine, there's a linear relation here in computer time, so that the highest quartile of kids, those are watching the top 25% of computer use, which was about 4 hours a day per more, which if you go back a few slides was around a quarter of kids, they have a 1.5 or 50% greater risk of those multiple risk behaviors. And in fact, that was a much stronger predictor of risk behavior than was television. Now, those risk behaviors didn't really include some of the other parameters that Christine was talking about in terms of aggressive behavior, the violent behavior. What the theorizing is from the researchers is that the television is frankly much better controlled than the internet. The internet exposes you to the full range of behaviors, whereas television is somewhat censored. But on the internet, gosh only knows what your kids are watching and being exposed to. So it was a much better predictor of these multiple risk behaviors with a 50% increase in relative risk from 1 to 1.5. We developed a program called Screen Smart from the Childhood Obesity Foundation. Our major interest in the Screen Smart or screen time reduction was around obesity. But when we did our focus groups initially talking to parents about Sip Smart, which is getting sugar sweetened beverage reduction, as well as screen time reduction, they're only sort of concerned about healthy weights, but they're really concerned about how their children's function, their mental health, how they do in school. So we developed the Screen Smart program, which is an interactive program for children grades K through 7. It's based on the social cognitive theory. The program is school facilitated, but focused on after school hours and in the home. I'm sure that the situation is the same pretty much across Canada in terms of all the do-gooders such as myself think, well, the school is the ideal place to teach this, it's the ideal place to teach that, but the teachers really have to take care of reading, writing, and arithmetic. They don't have a lot of time left over for other things, so they don't want to be inundated with requests for time. So ours is a 10-day program, which is relatively brief, and it only takes about 15 minutes per day of the teacher time, and a lot of the stuff is then done after school. We, as much as possible, try to align some of the content with the things that are taught in school with the existing math, PE, science, and health and career education program. So the goal is to increase awareness among students and their families of how much time they spend in front of the screen. So the day one is to create a pie graph of the data set of how much time they spend in front of the screen. And we also want to then teach children how to manage their screen time, how to choose recreational activities that support good health, and to reduce their screen time to less than 2 hours per day. The key messages were that childhood lifestyles persist into adulthood, that less screen time will equal better school performance, that our bodies are designed to move, and as a result, active people are healthier and happier, and that screen time displaces physical activity, reading, and socialization. So the program had some core elements, and there were 6 key messages. Along with that, screen time recommendations are less than 2 hours per day. I think Christine talked about it, but we all sort of alluded to this, that most parents are totally unaware of the detrimental effects of screen time and also as to what recommendations there are. And the knowledge that there are recommendations such as 2 hours or less per day, number one, it gives parents the knowledge, But number two, that it empowers them to say, no, this is the recommendation, so that they can then have that retort to the school when they, or to their child rather, when they say, well, Ginny watches for 6 hours or Sally watches for 3 hours. You can say, no, these are the recommendations. So the day 1 of the program and day 10 of the program consists of the screen time diary, so we can look to see what the changes are between day 1 and day 10. And in our program, there's a 1-day ultimate screen challenge, and that is no screen time for 24 hours on day 4. The second portion of the program, there's a trade 30, and the trade 30 concept is just to get children to realize that they can trade 30 minutes of screen time for fun physical activities. And there's a post-program component where children set their goals and then they track their goal progress over 1 to 2 week time frame. Also, what's very important, we think, is that the parents then are engaged early. Their letter goes out to the parent before the program begins. And in that letter is the key messages, and there is take-home messages that come through on a near daily basis to the parents from the school, snippets about information about aggression, about school performance, about ADHD, and also about the effect on healthy weights. There are also then some grade-dependent elements, so we tried to adapt it so it's more appealing to different grades. The grade 4 has a passport that the children fill out on a daily basis, and there is class and home-based activities just to raise their awareness of total screen time, but also raise their awareness of what they like to do instead of screen time. The grade 5 involves more charting, but in a more sophisticated way, so it aligns with the math program, so they can look at graphing and percentages, and also aligns with the health component, so there's the screen time effects on the body systems. Grade 6 is where we get into more of the messaging, I think that Christine was talking about, and about the folks that talked about Disney, is about media awareness, so that we're trying to get the children to be aware that they are targets for marketing and that they are actually being used, and for them to write some counter messaging around that. And grade 7, awareness of social media and the effects of social media. By grade 7, 8, 9, kids are texting more, they're doing more Facebook, and we want kids to be aware of the effects that has as well. So we did an initial evaluation. Before we implemented the program, we assayed the knowledge, attitudes, behavior, demographics, physical activity, as well as accelerometry. So we wanted to get a measure, not just self-reported, but how mobile these kids were. And then we did that as a baseline evaluation in September, October in 13 schools. Then we implemented the program and then did a follow-up evaluation a little bit later, again looking at the same parameters. We also did some more focus groups to ask people what they thought of the program, because we're in an iterative phase of this. We just had created the program. This was a pilot program, and we're constantly sort of reshaping and reformulating. Knowledge increased dramatically about the effects of screen time and the positive effects of reducing screen time. The number of TV minutes significantly decreased, but we saw some reduction in screen time, but it didn't reach the point of significance. It was less than 0.1. Accelerometry, the actual movement time, didn't seem to change, but we're okay with that. In terms of the thinking between the link of childhood obesity and screen time, a certain component is that kids are less active if they're not watching screens, but a lot of us think that the larger component is how they're being subjected to marketing, so that we know that kids tend to eat what they watch and they eat while they watch. So we think this is still quite a beneficial program. So our short-term results is that we did see changes in knowledge and self-reported TV screen time. Some of the feedback was that we needed to simplify the teacher resource. We needed a little bit more preparation for the teachers as well. But overall, the children liked it, and the parent and children awareness went up. Our program and resources are not quite as extensive as the SMART Take the Challenge group from Michigan had, but the screen time booklet is this size. There's an introductory segment for the teacher, but not all teachers have to read the entire amount. It's for all grades, K right through to grade 7. So it's very well laid out. Doesn't take a lot of the teacher's time, and then hopefully we'll get a bigger uptake to this in the future.